Welcome back to another episode of the Always About People show. Thank you for joining with us again live today. Gosh, this is our 11th episode already. We've had some incredible guests. I am your host, Chris Allen, and for those of you who are joining with us live, we're streaming on all of your major platforms, LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook. You can also watch these later. They'll be recorded and available for you. But please, we'd love for you to engage with us live. Send comments, send thoughts, send funny notes, whatever you want to do. Engage with us. We'd love to hear from you. And then there's also a way for you to subscribe and like to get future episodes. But today, I'm really excited about our conversation. In weeks past and in episodes past, we've been talking about this idea of the importance of values in an organization, values that bring people together and create community. And my guest today, I met randomly a few months back as I was helping do a leadership development session with a group. And we just happened to connect before this meeting. He wasn't even supposed to be a part of this, but I met Jay and I liked him from the very beginning. And all I did was mention this idea that I had been studying values in therapy from a psychology standpoint. And he lit up and said, gosh, I would love to talk more about that. And so we've been looking for opportunities to get together. But today's show, titled The Psychology of Values, we're going to have a conversation about how values are not only important in the workplace and in an organization, but how important values are to us as people. And the future Dr. Jared Hayes goes by Jay Hayes. Again, he's going to be a PhD doctor at some point in time, but gosh, I am so excited to have this conversation with him. Would you help me welcome the future Dr. Jay Hayes to the show?
Thanks for having me.
Hey, you're welcome. I'm glad you came in laughing.
It's always a good time when we connect. Definitely.
That's great. You've got joy written all over your face, and I see the sign behind you. Good vibes only, right?
Good vibes only. Yes, good vibes only. That's all I'm here for. Good vibes. That's it.
That's great. As we get started, one thought that I had is that for those who are joining us live, they probably look at your name down at the bottom and go, LCMHCA, the future doctor. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a pretty long acronym, right? But it stands for Licensed Clinical Mental Health Counseling Associate. So that is my title. That's my licensure here in the state of North Carolina.
That's awesome. All right, Jay, let's jump straight in. We don't have a ton of time and we have a lot to talk about, but referring to the psychology of values, that was the first conversation that we had because I'd mentioned to you that I had been reading this book, Values in Therapy. And I've been thinking through the importance of values in an organization that bring people in, that tie people to a community. And you said, oh man, I talk to people all the time about values. Why don't you just start by letting our guests know the importance of values in therapy as you see it, and the importance for each one of us in our own health around values.
Well, again, Chris, thanks for inviting me and having me here to speak with you guys more about values in your personal life as well as in the workplace. And I think that it's important to begin to define values before we really kind of go far with it. So for me, and I think by and large, values can be defined as those things that kind of guide our lives, those things that are most important to us, the characteristics that we want to display, the way that we treat others as well as ourselves, right? So when we think about values, they are kind of like the roadmap for our lives, how we decide what decisions we make. And oftentimes values tend to guide our lives without us even being fully aware that it is a value that is important to us. But when we hone down on them in our personal lives, excuse me, and also in the workplace, they tend to kind of help shape and lead us more to a fulfilling life. So that's why I work with values a lot as it relates to therapy, to help folks identify those specific values that are important to them, with a goal of leading them to a more fulfilling life.
Okay, I want to go back to that comment that you quickly ran by, which is sometimes people are not even aware of them.
Mhm, mhm,
So obviously, when people come in to you, they're dealing with something going on in their lives.
mhm.
Um, where do you start? How do you help them understand the importance of values from the beginning?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think one of the first things that we do is kind of just different values exercises, right? Because a lot of people haven't taken the time to really conceptualize what their specific values are. So I just share several different values with them. And from that long, large list that I have, we begin to kind of like dwindle it down. Right. And my role as a therapist and working with folks is to kind of listen to them and tease it out a little bit more, to challenge this, to challenge the values that they choose in that list, and kind of see how can we maybe even eliminate more. So for example, I was working with a client recently, and they told me on their list they had chosen truthfulness, honesty, and authenticity, right? So as are dwindling it down to the ones that are like top values or core values for that individual, we begin to look at each of these values. Authenticity, for example, seems to a component of it seems to be honesty. Another component of it seems to be truthfulness. So how about we just remove those and rock with authenticity in order to help them kind of to find their own and move in that direction for themselves.
Hmm. Okay, so after you've helped them narrow it down,
Mhm.
so let's go with this example.
Okay.
Um, Authenticity is one of my values as well.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
let's just stick with that. But it as as you help somebody dwindle that down, then what's the next step? How
Yeah.
so if the goal is to get healthy, if the
Mhm,
goal is to have a healthy life, a
mhm,
fulfilled life, how
mhm.
do I take a value like authenticity and turn it into something fulfilling?
Yeah, that's a good question. How would one take a value like authenticity and make it something fulfilling? Well, a lot of times I think also in my role that many folks perceive a therapist, mental health counselor to be one who gives advice, right? But that's not really the case. I don't give advice because I'm not responsible for the outcomes of that. I want my clients to fully own that. So I won't make a decision for you. I allow them to make those decisions for themselves. So when it comes time for them to make those decisions, what should I do? Should I go left or should I go right? Then we come back to the values and say, how are your values being fulfilled by the different decisions that you have before you? If you're thinking about changing jobs and you crave authenticity, right? How is this workplace, how is this environment going to satisfy that value for you, if at all, right? And if it doesn't, then it helps them kind of readjust and begin to think more outside of the box for something that may be better suited for them. Because at the end of the day, what leaves us drained, what leads to burnout, what contributes to just a poor quality of life, most often is when our values are not being met. So
Hmm.
my role is to kind of like always remind them of the values that they have, right? And refocus their attention there and saying, how are these values being satisfied in your life? I also want to say really quickly that values can change, right? The values that's important to a person today can definitely be different 5 or 10 years from now, right? But it's kind of like a roadmap, a starting point to give you an idea of what really gives a person life.
Hmm. I love it because what's spinning in my brain right now, Jay, is that this is perfectly correlated to the workplace.
Mhm,
So, let's just say that we step into a workplace as always about people
mhm,
and we help them identify the values of the organization.
mhm,
It's what the organization values today. It's the behaviors that they want to see. And as the organization makes decisions going forward, decisions about who to hire,
mhm,
decisions about which business to go after,
mhm,
decisions about other things that might be involved inside the organization, those decisions need to be filtered through the values.
Mm-hmm.
And even in most organizations, I'll see that an organization might move away from the values that they think are so important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's the times when I get called into organizations because the leadership is drained or exhausted that oftentimes they're not in alignment with their values.
Mm-hmm.
Then the other really interesting thing that you said is that values can change. And I meet with a lot of executives who think that the values are what they are and have to be the same because I developed the values 10 years ago, but everything has changed.
Mm-hmm.
And so thank you for giving us permission to actually change the values.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So back to the individual, though. If an individual takes this value of authenticity and begins to make decisions through the filter of authenticity, what kind of questions do you ask that person? I know you're not answering it for them, but what kind of questions are you asking them to help them filter it through?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chris. I think one of the biggest questions, well, one of the, I guess, most obvious questions that I would ask is, how is this value being fulfilled? Like, where does it exist in this choice? Helping them identify it. Where is truthfulness? And I think also with that, I'm sorry. And I think also with that, helping them identify their different values and realizing that they may change, and aligning them is really, I apologize. It's really just kind of helping them to hone down on what's important to them.
Mm-hmm.
From there, I apologize. Can you share the question with me just one more time?
Yeah, you're fine. Like when somebody is filtering a decision
Mhm.
through that value, what kind of questions are you asking them?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, how does this? What's important to them? And also, I think it's very important for folks to understand the consequences, right, that come along with the different values that we have, right? Because with every decision that we make, there will be both pros and cons. So we spend a lot of time exploring both the pros and cons of maintaining a particular value. For example, as it relates to authenticity, right? I'm sure that there are various job sectors where authenticity may be compromised. Some of the first that come to mind may be, for example, maybe in sales, right? Or in the legal field, you may suspect that authenticity may be compromised. And then in a capitalist economy where everything is driven by money, right? A lot of times it can, that compromises our values. Am I willing to risk losing monetary gain, right, in order for my values to be fulfilled? So it's really teasing out both the pros and the cons for them so that they're making a very well-informed decision.
Well, I've got two things that I'm thinking about right now. One of them is that organizations need to think about people through the lens of values also. So
Mhm.
let's say that an organizational value is honesty or integrity,
Mm.
but you have a salesperson who is not behaving in an honest way.
Mhm.
What do you do?
Mhm.
Well,
Mhm.
to your point, the future Dr. J. Hayes, to your point, there's a consequence.
Mhm.
There is a consequence. While we may not be able to measure it, we might not be able to define it right now. There is a consequence to tolerating behavior
Mhm.
that is not in alignment with our values.
Mhm.
I think what would be interesting, Jay, is to talk about what are some of the consequences people feel or see when they are not in alignment with their values. What happens?
Oh, most definitely burnout, conflict, frustration, all of the unpleasant emotions, right, tend to arise when your values aren't being fulfilled, whether it's in your personal life or in the workplace. There is no fulfillment. And a lot of times, I think there are people who compromise their values for other purposes. A lot of times for monetary gain or how it can benefit them for what they see for their life. However, the vision that they may have for their life to have, a really nice home and really expensive cars and only name brand clothing, expensive name brand clothing, that may not that may be more driven, consumer driven, and than it is driven by what they desire. When in that actuality, what may make them fulfilled, what may make them happy, may actually just be a quiet, simple life.
Hmm. That's really important. I mean,
Mhm.
we're coming up on Christmas here when we're recording this live, and I think we live in a society that's so consumeristic. We
Mhm.
are driven by these consumer desires.
Mhm.
And yet the reality is that those may not actually be the desires that fulfill.
Mhm.
So then what we're seeing in the workplace right now is, in light of the great resignation, people are on the move. And I guess I would maybe just ask you, do you think that has anything to do with the fact that values are not being fulfilled?
Oh, most definitely. I definitely believe that, with the change in generations, as millennials become the more, I guess, prominent generation and boomers kind of phase out of the workplace. Yeah, I think that what's most important to millennials and especially Gen Zers is that they are being personally fulfilled. So we're seeing an increase of creatives, right? Job markets that have never really been tapped before, because for people to feel a sense of fulfillment. This is what I desire to do. I prefer to create videos, create content, do all of this instead of a standard 9 to 5. So it's kind of figuring out, how can I reshape and restructure my life in order for those values to be fulfilled. I'll
Hmm.
even give you a personal example from my life. One of my high values, and I didn't realize it was so important to me until recently, is flexibility. Flexibility and freedom seem to go hand in hand. And I had been in a workplace previously where it was very cookie cutter for everyone. A standard 9 to 6 schedule. You get your hour lunch, and everybody's kind of working the hustle and the bustle that goes along with it. But that doesn't always work for me. Sometimes I work best in the wee hours of the night, right? Sometimes I may need to, I've been working out a lot lately. So sometimes I may
You,
need a
you look
morning
you,
workout.
you look great, Jay.
Hey, I appreciate
Yeah.
that. But sometimes I need to focus on my morning workout so that I feel fulfilled, so that I feel energized, and I'm able to perform at an optimum level in the workplace as well. So for me, that workplace wasn't satisfying. I found myself very unfulfilled, very drained, and really, honestly, on the brink of burnout. So I had to kind of readjust my life to make sure that my values are being fulfilled. What's important to me is being met so that I can meet other goals and objectives in the workplace.
All right, Jay, I'm gonna have you go through a scenario with me.
Sure.
I get to bring you into an organization.
Hmm.
Okay, you come in with me. We go into this organization, and we get to sit down with the executive team. And the executive team starts telling us how attrition is happening. They're losing great people.
Hmm.
Um, what would you recommend? They're going to ask us, what would you recommend that we do?
Hmm.
And I might say something like, hey, can you tell us what your mission, vision, values are?
Hmm.
And they walk through these values. But then they say, that's the issue, is we have all of this stuff in place, Chris, but we just can't seem to get people to connect with
Hmm.
what we're doing.
Hmm. Hmm.
What would you advise a business owner in that moment?
Hmm.
Because you might be seeing the people who are leaving that organization in your own personal practice, and they're all saying, this organization doesn't align with my values. And then you get to meet the organization, and the organization is saying, we don't understand, people aren't aligning with our values.
Hmm.
How do we solve this issue? Because it's bigger than we even think right now.
Yeah, yeah,
What
that's a
would,
great question.
what would you tell that executive team?
Yeah, I think one of the first things. So I tend to take a posture of curiosity before anything. I love information. I love feedback, and I believe that the more information that we have, the better decisions we're able to make. So one of the places I would be curious about is, how is that presented on the front end, right? When you go through the recruitment and hiring process, how are values exhibited in those spaces?
Hmm.
How is that pitched to the folks who prospective employees? And I will also be interested in the back end, right? When it comes to what do they call them? The exit surveys that
Yeah.
are often done when an employee leaves. What's the feedback that they're giving? What are they saying is the reason that they are leaving these positions? And I think that that gives us a better idea of kind of how things may need to be reshaped, restructured, or revamped in order to really identify and recruit and retain, right? Because we're talking about retention, to retain those employees. And also, another piece that I would be curious about is even throughout the employment, like the tenure of employment, right? Like what value based activities are being done, what strategies are being implemented to make sure that those values are being met for the employees in the workplace.
I love it. I think you just gave some really, really valuable advice. So, if I could sum it up to an
Mhm,
executive team, how are you displaying or communicating your values on the front end?
mhm,
And again, there are so many different channels for communicating right now:
mhm,
website, social media,
mhm.
digital, other digital ways. But how are you communicating those values? Because even on the front end, attracting employees who align with the values of your organization are really important.
Yes.
Now, the future Dr. J. If an organization has these values written out and they're on the wall,
Mhm,
but they do not align with the values that they've actually written out,
mhm.
what then?
Well, I think the first thing that came to my mind is, it seems like a fraud or a phony, right? Because you're saying, "Hey, we purport ourselves to be this way," right? But then when you actually come into the company and do business with us, however that looks, that's not really the case. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. But I'm thinking more solution focused. Like, so what then is your question? I think that yeah, it will be hard. It will be time for some hard looks and hard conversations about what does it look like to share these values, to begin to explore how did you know um, authenticity, what does authenticity feel like, what is integrity, how is that communicated, what are actions, what are behaviors that can be taken to display these values in on the front end, on the back end, and as well as throughout the tenure of employment to make sure that our company, that this company is really doing what it says it is supposed to do.
Mm.
And that starts from from the top down, and I think the bottom up, because a lot of the best feedback that you'll get from your teams won't necessarily be on from the folks that's working at the top. It's at the people who are doing the grunt level work, because those are the ones that are most important to making sure that the infrastructure of the workplace remains strong.
All right. I don't think I could have said it any better. What you just communicated was, hey, executives, let's make sure that these values are communicated on the front end,
Hmm.
that they are strengthened during the employment life cycle,
Hmm.
and that you're getting some valuable feedback upon exit.
Hmm.
But let's also make sure that we're exhibiting these behaviors every day, that we're not frauds or we're not phonies.
Hmm.
Let me ask it from an individual psychological standpoint.
Sure.
When somebody comes in and you're helping them to identify values and they state that these certain values are what are important to me,
Hmm.
how do you make sure that those are the actual values
Hmm.
rather than them being phony?
Hmm. Hmm. Chris, I love that question. I admit I got really excited when you asked me that question. I might have looked cool and composed, but I actually got really excited because a big part of my role is actually to challenge that. That's a big part of my role. And I think in the workplace, as well as on an individual level, we have to be willing to receive critical feedback from others that sometimes challenges our perspectives, right? So, working with an individual in therapy, and they may say, hey, integrity is a big value for me. But as I've spent time with this person week in and week out, listening to what's important to them, listening to the different content that they've shared, I begin to notice, right, that doesn't really seem like a value that's super high to you. You told me that integrity was important to you, but in this instance, I noticed that you made this decision that wasn't in alignment with integrity. You made that decision that wasn't in line with integrity, and there's another one that you're considering making that doesn't really seem to be in line with integrity, right?
Yeah.
And coming from a posture of like not from a posture of harm, but really from curiosity to say, well, again, values can change and that's okay. It doesn't seem like integrity may be the highest value for you. It seems like there may be another value that's more important to you. Can we spend some time and look at that and see if we need to make some adjustments for your life in order for you to move in a better direction? And in the workplace, I think that's super important as well, to be able to receive that critical feedback like, hey, I don't think that you guys are being as honest or as authentic, right, as you may desire to be or purport yourself to be, and that employees don't fear consequences, right, or reprimand from being able to express themselves in that way to the higher ups, to the executives of that business, that they are open and willing to listen and adjust as needed.
All right, let's go back to something that you've now said twice,
Okay.
which is let's engage the right people in the
Mhm.
conversation.
Mhm.
So, your ability to challenge an individual on what actually matters most or the values that matter most is something that you can do in a one-on-one setting.
Mhm.
To the executives or to the leadership of an organization, how can you engage people at the right level in
Mhm.
assessing what your organization values? Because the people who might know are the ones who are at the so-called bottom of the organization,
Mhm.
who are living this thing out every day.
Mhm.
Maybe there's a way that you can go and ask them, "Hey, what are the values that you're
Mhm.
seeing? What
Mhm.
do we value?"
Mhm.
Because if we value these things on paper,
Mhm.
but we are not living them out, or we're tolerating behaviors in conflict with those
Mhm.
values,
Mhm.
well, those aren't the values.
Mhm.
So it's almost like you're saying, "Hey, no matter what you have on paper, if that's not what you're actually basing your decisions off of,
Mhm.
then you're a phony."
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Is
I
that a
agree.
is that
Yeah.
accurate?
I mean, I agree 100%. And I think that is exactly why people leave the workplace, when they feel that there is a disconnect because between what is said by a company and then actually what is done.
Mm,
So as one of our viewers commented, measurement definitely is key. But I think before measurement is definitely to create a safe space, right, on each level of the organization, to where everyone is able to express themselves openly and freely, because you want that good feedback. And if folks are afraid that there are going to be consequences, reprimand for expressing themselves, they'll be less likely to do it, right? You have a team of yes men that are in place that are really just going to tell you what you want to hear. But if you're able to create a safe space for each of your on each level of the company, right? So for folks to be able, or each team, right, dividing it up into teams, to where folks are able to express themselves and share their feedback, and it's invited. I think that is probably the key, that it's invited. How can we be better? How are you seeing? What is your experience like? Then I think it creates an open dialogue along all levels of the organization, from the top to the bottom, bottom to top, that everyone is getting an ear to find out what is really making this company tick. What's the environment like? What's your experience like? And how can we make it better?
psychological safety, right?
Mhm.
Psychological safety. And
Mhm.
I guess what I want to say is, when you think about individuals who are convinced that they value something,
Mhm.
and they come to you and they pay you to help them think through why their life is so unfulfilled,
Mhm.
and they pay you to challenge them,
Mhm.
how do you create that safe space
Mhm.
where you can engage in conversation with them?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think one of the for me, I think one of the biggest elements or components of that is curiosity.
Hmm.
versus being critical, right? Because in life, we can choose to approach things from either one of two perspectives. It can be kind of like open and curious, right? Or closed and critical. And I think that that sets the foundation for it. So, me inviting questions and being slower to speak and quicker to listen. I want to know your thoughts. I want to know how you're feeling. I want to know what your experience is like. A constant invitation, right? From manager to employee, and among employees to where that dialogue is being shared, right? And then
Hmm.
empathy, right? Because if I'm taking a position of criticism, right, then immediately when a person tells me something that I don't like or may not necessarily agree with, what happens? I become defensive. I brush them off, and several other things, negative experiences may happen, right? But if I'm able to display empathy and just listen, right, then that does over time, that does create a strong rapport to where employees, clients, whomever it is, they feel heard, they feel seen, they feel like someone is attuning to them. Attunement is one of the biggest pieces in creating that safe space, because whether it's in this workplace or another, in this relationship or another, we all have experienced the full gambit of emotions, right? So being able to say, yes, I understand what that may be like for you. I can only imagine what that has been like for you, and inviting more and more feedback. I think those are some of the fundamental pieces in really creating a safe space.
All right. You introduced us to a few new words.
Sure.
Attunement.
Mm-hmm.
Being attuned to employees in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Or for you, it's being attuned to this individual that's coming in to meet with
Mm-hmm.
you. Then this concept of curious or
Mm-hmm.
curiosity over being critical.
Mm-hmm.
Are you curious or critical? And
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's a huge takeaway today for those viewers who are watching this. The psychology of values might just be about being curious rather than being critical. And I think that that's huge. I think that organizations need to understand that. I think organizations need to engage with people at the right levels to define values
Mm-hmm.
by being curious and not critical.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, in your work with individuals, you're helping them to uh, be in this safe space where they can explore their own personal values
Mm-hmm.
and begin to filter life decisions through those values.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe one encouragement that we can give to those viewers who are leading workplaces today would be how do you get your values out there? How do you communicate your values clearly? And then how do you make sure that the organization stays aligned with those values? And then by stating those values clearly up front, individuals who are coming back from sessions with the future Dr. J, they know what values are important to them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can create a workplace where individual values are aligned with the values of the organization, that's how you create community that stays.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The future Dr. J, any last bits of wisdom that you can share with all of us?
I just want to reemphasize the importance of curiosity over criticism. And I think in personal relationships, in the workplace, that can be one of a posture of criticism can be a barrier to deeper relationships.
Hmm.
And we know that with good connections, good relationships, that there are insurmountable tasks that can be achieved. So in those moments where you might find yourself a bit defensive, or in being curious, right, and trying to be curious and receiving feedback, it's kind of like just taking a step. Take a second to just reel yourself in and be open to just receiving, right, without giving any feedback, without being defensive, just kind of taking a posture of just listening. My role in this place, walking in, excuse me to say, my role at this time is just to listen. I just want to hear. And I think that alone will really deepen relationships and help those values become more evident within the workplace.
Jay, I just think you solved the world's problems. Because if we could just be honest for a second, this is the Always About People show.
Mhm.
And to be always about people is to be a little more curious and a little less critical.
Mhm.
And I think if all of us were a little more curious, we asked more questions, we listened more, instead of feeling like we had to get our point across or talk. We learned a lot. Jay, I just want to thank you for joining me today. Thanks for this conversation. There's so many more directions we could go, so much more. I'm going to have you back. We're going to have to go deeper into some of these psychological terms, but you've introduced us to a couple of great ideas. The first being attuned. Be attuned to your people. Spend more time being curious instead of critical. Define your values up front. Be clear about them. Communicate them. Reinforce them through the employee life cycle, and then be willing to accept feedback on the way out. And man, if we could do that, if we could align people's values with our organizational values, we'd see more lives fulfilled. And I think that one of the main issues with the Great Resignation right now is that people are saying, hey, my values don't align.
Yeah.
Hey, I don't feel like I'm growing as a person. I'm discontent. And Jay, you're solving it on the individual level. I'm passionate about solving it on more of the corporate organizational level. But I just want to thank you for the work that you do every day. I appreciate you. Man, it's been fun, been a fun conversation. So thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you, Chris, for having me. I appreciate it. It's been fun, man. It's been a real pleasure to be here. And I look forward to future conversations with you.
Awesome. Well, to our guests, thank you for joining us live today. Just a reminder, every week, Tuesdays, noon Eastern, we stream live on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook. We'd love for you to join us on future episodes of the Always About People show. Until next time, see you then.